We can understand the 12 houses of our natal chart at a deeper level if we start from what defines them in the first place, the angles. Your natal chart and all the 12 houses start from your ascendant. The ascendant is where the horizon was rising when you were born. The descendant is the opposite point, where the horizon was setting when you were born. If we think of the ascendant as the sunrise, the descendant is the sunset. That's why the ascendant in the first house describes you, while the descendant in the seventh house describes the other. The 12th house is on top of the first house, so it represents what's above the ego, what we cannot see, our blind spot, but also what we can grow and develop into. The second house is just under the first house, what we stand on, what we own. So it represents that part of ourselves that feeds the ego, that part of ourselves that works in our favor. That's why the second house is the house of money, possessions, talents, food, and energy levels. It is what we own, what is ours. The second house is our piggy bank of talents, energy, and assets. The second house describes qualities we already own and are ready to harness. The descendant, in the seventh house, is the other, and in the chart, it represents our relationships, our contracts, and where we aim to find equality. The seventh house is also the house of conflict, open enemies, and negotiations, because having equal relationships is a result of knowing when to set boundaries and when to compromise. The sixth house is under the seventh house, so it shows where we feel we are below the other. The sixth house is the house of work and service. It is where we need to grow, to put some effort, where we need to deliver so that we are on an equal stand with others. The eighth house is on top of the descendant, and it shows where we feel we've done more than our fair share in relationships. It is the house of intimacy and trust. But it can also be the house of entitlement. This is where we feel the other owes us something. Now let's move on to the other pair of angles, the Imam Coli, or the IC, and the midheaven. The IC is the lowest point in our chart, when it's completely dark outside. The midheaven is the highest point in the chart, where the sun shines at its brightest, and there is no shadow. The IC and the fourth house is our baseline. It represents our family, roots, home, comfort zone, and tradition. The IC is that part of us that doesn't change because it defines us at a cellular level. We can't change our parents, and we can't change our genes. The IC is the core of who we are, as opposed to the qualities we develop throughout life. The third house is before the fourth house, so it represents everything that happens before we find our roots in the fourth house. Have you noticed how a cat behaves when she moves to a new home? The cat usually spends a few days getting acquainted with the new space, checking all the spots, sniffing everything around, basically making sure there is no hidden danger. That's why the third house rules our acquaintances, information analysis, research, small trips, and errands. These are the small things we do every day to make sure we have a safe and comforting place to come back to. The third house also rules communication, because it is through communication that we gather the information we need and adjust our expectations. The third house also rules siblings, because we share 50% of our DNA with our siblings. The fifth house is after the fourth house, so it represents everything that happens after we find our roots and sense of safety in the fourth house. The fifth house is what we create, including our children. The fifth house is also where we find joy, relaxation, and pleasure if we have embraced the fourth house. When we can easily find joy, hobbies, romantic partners, and have no troubles expressing ourselves creatively, this is when we have a healthy fourth house. If someone feels creatively blocked, the answers can usually be found in the previous house. the 4th house. The midheaven in the 10th house is opposite of the IC, so it is what we grow into, where we seek progress and change. If the IC is the lowest point in the chart, the midheaven is the highest. When the sun is at zenith, there's no shadow and nowhere to hide. That's why the midheaven rules our public life, as opposed to our private life, which is the IC. The midheaven represents the qualities we consciously develop because we find them desirable, as opposed to qualities we are born with, which are ruled by the IC. The midheaven also rules our career and vocation, but in general, it rules all the activities, people, and projects we feel drawn to because we find them as being of a higher standard. These midheaven 10th house aspirations will push us to go outside our comfort zone and develop new skills and qualities we didn't have at birth. The 9th house comes before the 10th house, and it represents all the endeavors that prepare us to become the highest version of ourselves. That's why the 9th house rules learning, travel, explorations, foreign places and people, and everything that teaches us something and opens our minds in some way. The 9th house is also the house of goals and planning, because in order to find success, midheaven, we first need to envision this future. The 9th house is also the house of law, apostles, and legal paperwork, where we prove that we've done our homework and we are legit. The 11th house comes after the 10th house, so it represents everything that happens after we grow into the best version of ourselves, what happens after we find our vocation. That's why in the 11th house, we have a strong need to share and implement our vision, usually in a group of people. Since the 10th house is where we peak, in the 11th house, our personal success doesn't matter that much, and we are less driven by ambition, but by a desire to implement our vision and drive that change. The 11th house is the house of teamwork, where we ally with other people to spread the 10th house ideal to as many people as possible. When we look at houses as being derived from the angles, we gain a totally new perspective of their themes and qualities, and we see connections that are not obvious otherwise.